Okay, hello again. What am I doing here? Welcome to the section of Political Science 110 here on everybody's favorite branch of government, Congress, right? The first branch. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., this is a pretty powerful view on Capitol Hill. If you've never been, I do suggest going. It's actually a decent city. A lot to see, a lot to do, and a lot of it's free. Um, but anyway, here's the Capitol building. This is where Congress does its business, so to speak. Um, Start with the discussion question here. Were we in class face to face, we would usually start with something like this. Which of the following institutions do you trust the most? The vast majority of us would not pick Congress, right? That is just the nature of the beast. Congress has a pretty bad name. This is data I found on my own. This is not from any of the textbooks that we're using here, but congressional approval rating from 1976 to 2017. You can see the big 2001, call that the September 11th bump, where Congress had a job approval rating in the 80s, twice more than Trump ever had as president. But Congress is not as popular as President Trump ever was, because Congress's approval rating hovers around the high teens usually on any given day. We don't like Congress, right, for some strange reason. However, this is the first branch of government. The founders, the founding fathers, I'm using air quotes here, designed Congress to be the first and most important branch of government. The U.S. Congress is more independent and powerful than legislatures in most other industrialized countries. I'm not going to bore you with the difference between a presidential system and a parliamentary system, but in parliamentary systems like in the UK, the prime minister, who's the head of government, is also a member of parliament. That's the prime minister, right? In a presidential system, a president is independent of the legislative branch, which has advantages for the president, but it also has advantages for Congress, or whatever legislative body we're talking about. And in this case, the U.S. Congress is completely independent from the president. I will add the caveat, though, as we've seen in the Biden administration, the vice president is, of course, the president of the Senate and holds a tie-breaking vote in the case of a 50-50 split. So that's the only overlap between Congress and the executive. But Article 1 of the Constitution outlines the powers of Congress, and it's by far the longest article of the Constitution because Congress does a lot of things, right? Congress can tax and spend, has the power to raise an army, navy, and to declare war. I put that in bold and in italics because that's something that Congress constitutionally is empowered to do, but hasn't done so since the Second World War. Right, what Congress does now is it authorizes the president to use force. Congress can regulate commerce, interstate commerce, can't regulate commerce within a state, but it can regulate commerce between or among states, has the power to coin money and regulate the currency. We've talked about the necessary and proper clause that gives Congress a lot of leeway to make laws on things that can be argued to fit under its remit. Today, presidents play a bigger role in each of these areas. We'll talk more about this when we get to the next section on the president, but so I'll leave it at that for now. We've talked throughout about representation thus far. Congress is the most important representative institution in the U.S. government. It's not to say that it is a proper, complete, and fair representation of the people, but it is the most representative institution in government, more so than the Supreme Court or the presidency, of course. A member's primary responsibility is to his or her constituency, which is the district making up the area from which the official is elected. In the House of Representatives, of course, that's districts within states. In the Senate, the district is, in effect, the state. Key question to ask, and this came up earlier, what constitutes fair and effective representation? That's hard to say, right? It's hard to say for a lot of different reasons. Let's first think about what members of Congress actually do, right? They can represent different interests differently, right? Members of Congress can represent individual constituents to, say, solve problems, sponsor private bills, provide information, answer complaints. Members of Congress also represent organized interests. That could be a labor union, business interests, whatever, by introducing legislation, trying to obtain grants. I mean, there are a lot of different ways. I'm not going to read the list to you. You can read that on your own if you like. But then obviously members of Congress also represent their district as a whole, right? So, I mean, we can talk about representation, and I'll do this in just a sec, how most members of Congress are overwhelmingly old white men with advanced degrees. But these old white men with advanced degrees also have to represent their districts in different ways, right? So, I mean, there's just layers of representation here going on. Members of Congress have agency, right? These are representatives who are held accountable to their constituents if they fail to represent them properly, right? This is the principal-agent relationship we talked about early on. We are the principals as electors, and we elect agents to represent us. This agency can take two differing forms. Which is to say that members of Congress can view themselves as a delegate, in which case legislators see themselves as perfect agents of others, of their constituents. They're elected to do the bidding of those who sent them to the legislature, to Congress. Or members of Congress, through their agency, can view themselves as trustees, that they've been elected based on, and they will do what they think is best for the constituency, right? I hope you're seeing the distinction here. One is which, in the first case, as a delegate, the elected official seeks to do what the constituents want that person to do. A trustee views themselves as someone who's been selected and now can do what they want because they have the trust of their constituents. The delegate tends to listen more to what the constituents want, right? Let's think about descriptive representation here. These are shared characteristics and experiences that allow a representative to serve and draw support from those with whom they share an identity. Descriptive representation for African Americans and Hispanics has been facilitated by the drawing of majority-minority districts in some states, usually larger states like California. We could see this. There are shortcomings for others. I think there are only 4 Native Americans in the House of Representatives, if I'm not mistaken. LGBTQ individuals, atheists, class division, etc. There's a discussion of this on Katznelson, page 236 to 239, where Katznelson et al. Talk about members of Congress and the demographic composition of past Congresses, because again, this book was published several years ago, but I still like it. The Lowy textbook, the newest edition, which you might not have purchased, the 16th edition, gives us this demographic breakdown of the 116th Congress. And you can see that the average age is pretty old, a bit older in the Senate than in the House. Most folks work in the highly skilled service sector. No one in the Senate has only a high school degree as their highest degree, right? And I mean, I think it's good that we elect people who know how the system works, have studied, maybe taken a class like this one. But it might not be a bad thing if there were more plumbers and truck drivers and daycare operators and what have you elected to Congress. That might help ameliorate the shortcomings of representation, right? 24% of the Senate has a PhD, 34% has a medical degree, 24% of the population does not have a PhD in real life, right? So there you go. Same goes with religion. The gender imbalance is clear and obvious. So is the racial and ethnic imbalance, et cetera. So, how descriptive is Congress of the country on the whole? Not very much. Same problem comes up in California, right? The Van Vechten chapter on the state assembly is pretty clear, doesn't hide from the obvious. This is from page 47 of the Van Vechten textbook, and you can see that the population of California by race and ethnicity is not reflected in the state legislature by race and ethnicity, nor is it reflective of the gender breakdown either, right? So this is a reality. Things are moving in, I think, the right direction of more representation in recent election cycles, but it's going to take a while for all these old white guys to retire. And I'll explain how that's a variable in just a sec. Um, Differences in representation when it comes to the U.S. House and Senate. The Congress is, of course, a bicameral legislature, meaning that it has two chambers or two houses. The Senate is smaller and thus nominally more deliberative with 100 members, two per state. You should know this. Hopefully, this is the stuff you knew prior to taking this class. The House of Representatives is larger with 135 members. Thus, power is more centralized and the process is a bit more organized because if not, the House would be a bit more unruly than it already is. But the House represents the people by districts. And again, California has, 50-some districts. Texas has 30-some. Wyoming has one, right? Because of Wyoming is the least populated state, and the entire state is, in effect, one district in the House. So the representation is different. This in brief, I put these things in just in case you don't want to consult the textbook if you're scrolling through the PowerPoints while you take the exam or something. But this is on page 133 of the 16th edition. Gives you just some of the rules of differences between the House and the Senate, minimum age, minimum length of U.S. citizenship, and the terms, right? Know that House members serve 2-year terms and senators serve 6-year terms. That is important that you know. The House, because it's more directly representative, members they tend to be more local in their focus on their constituencies. Since senators represent states, the Senate tends to focus on things more broadly, state level to the federal level. The California legislature resembles the U.S. Congress in form in that it's bicameral with an upper and a lower house with different membership numbers and lengths of terms. It's also similar in function in that the two chambers are meant to check each other. This is in Sacramento, right? So it mirrors what it's like in D.C. The upper house is the Senate. It has 40 members that each represent around 900 million people. These are elected to state senators in California, elected to 4-year terms. Democrats are the majority. The leader is called the president pro tem. The lower house is the state assembly in California. It has twice as many members and thus represents about half as many people as senators do, also elected to 4-year terms. Democrats are also the majority. The leader is called the speaker of the assembly. Thinking about who runs for electoral office, Congress members as agents, since they are agents, electoral considerations are, of course, very important. And to win, candidates need a few pretty important things. First of all, you need ambition. You need to raise a lot of money. It helps to have name recognition and a strong political base, and it helps to be a bit charismatic and have strong personal organization. We tend not to elect unambitious, non-charismatic people who can't raise money, whose names we don't know. But this is why incumbency is important. And incumbency is a factor that I alluded to earlier that helps us to explain why the demographic representation of particularly the Senate in D.C. Is not very representative of the population of the United States on the whole. And that's because you've got people serving in the Senate who were first elected. I don't know when the oldest senator was first elected, but I bet there are people who were elected in the late 70s who are still serving today, right? And that's because the best way to predict who's going to win an election for the Senate in particular, but also for the House, is whether or not the person holding that office is running, right? That's the person holding the office running for re-election is called the incumbent. Incumbency is when you hold the office and you're running for re-election. And it's a very important advantage in congressional elections because you've got a history of casework and patronage. You've done things for your constituents nominally. This used to be a real reality, what we call pork barrel legislation or earmarks. This is when member of Congress would add amendments to a bill that might not have anything to do with the bill, but that would bring money back to their district. And, people tend to like that. Public works projects, investment in roads and schools and post offices and what have you. But once you hold office, when you can do that and then go up for reelection, say, hey, here's what I've done for you, it helps. It's a key to victory. It also helps that then the name recognition leads to early money. Once someone's elected to the House or the Senate, one of the first things they do once they get to Washington is start raising money for their next election. It's a sad process, but it helps. The person holding the office has the jump on what needs to be done to get reelected, and that's why we see this here. Since 1964, the power of incumbency is clear. You can see moments of change, like when Reagan was elected. You had a lot of Democrats lose in the Senate in 1980. But generally speaking, the re-election rate is around 90% for both the House and the Senate. Right? This is from the straight out of the Lowy textbook. See, I don't have a page number here, and I'm not going to. Oh, well, here it is. It's on page 137 of the 16th edition. But and this link here, I believe, takes you to a silly Stephen Colbert farcical interview with a former member of the House from Florida, where Stephen gets him to say just very outlandish things, knowing that it's not going to hurt his reelection bid because people tend to get reelected. This has changed over time, and this is one of the reasons why I still like to use the Katznelson book. It's got some really good quotes, even though some of the data is a little outdated. It helps us to really understand the dynamics of power in the United States in a longer historical context. So I don't often do this, but here I'm going to read this because I want this to sink in. In the 19th century, congressional turnover was very high. In 1870, more than half of the representatives sent to the House were newly elected. By 1900, new members of Congress comprised less than 1/3. By 1940, less than 1/4, and by 1998, less than 1/10. Right, and so less than 1/10, fewer than 1/10, were new members to the House of Representatives, and that reflects exactly what we saw in the previous slide. About 90% get reelected. About 10% are new any given Congress. So that really just shows the historical evolution of incumbency. And you've seen by now that I'm really bouncing around among the 3 chapters that I assigned for this week. I said early in the semester we'd start by looking at Lowy, looking at Katznelson, and now everything just kind of runs together. So it's really up to you how you want to read things, read the chapters, etc. But anyway, back to California here. What makes California unique compared to the United States, and really compared to a lot of other state legislatures as well, is term limits, right? And this was imposed by voters via one of those, what do you call them? I never remember the term. It's in effect a referendum. Darn it, the word escapes me. That you vote on. Not petitions. Propositions. Sorry, darn it, propositions. In 1990, voters decided to impose term limits on the legislature. So legislators can now serve up to 12 years in one or both houses, either or. But after you hit 12 years of service, you cannot serve in the legislature again. Some argue that this means that you lose a lot of experience and information earned and gained while serving constituents. Others argue that it's important to bring in new ideas and new people, and that, I think, in the long term helps weed out the lingering effects of the old white guy syndrome in Congress. So I think if there were term limits nationally, we'll say, for the House and Senate, I think we'd start to see the U.S. House and Senate be more representative sooner than as it stands now. But anyway, another problem, I would say problem, is money in congressional elections. I'm not necessarily a fan of this, but it makes the United States unique. One of the big reasons congressional incumbents are so safe is that they raise and spend more money than their opponents do, because, again, they get the jump. From day one, they're raising money. So this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Campaign donors don't want to give money to losers, so that's why incumbents often get more money, right? Because they usually win. Is representation limited by fundraising? I would say yes. We don't have a lot of poor people donating money they don't have to political campaigns. So surprise, surprise, the laws that get made tend not to function in the interests of those who don't donate money, right? Makes sense, sadly. Here's a hyperlink. I believe this one goes to a John Oliver Last Week Tonight clip that's about 20 minutes long, but like the John Oliver clips, very informative and very funny, and probably with some potty humor. But there's a good breakdown of how the fundraising begins as soon as you're elected to Congress. Why does this need to happen? Well, I still use this from the Katz-Nielsen textbook because the same data is not provided in the Lowy textbook. So this information goes back to 2012, so it's a little dated, but you can see how much it costs to run for the Senate in Massachusetts. $75 million. And those numbers have only gone up and up and up, assuredly. So yeah, I mean, I bet they've probably doubled by now, is my guess. And I'm guessing in more recent years, like in the 2020 Arizona Senate race, I'm sure more than $24 million was spent, assuredly. There's a upcoming race in 2022 in Wisconsin, Senate race, and I bet that figure is going to be the $34.6 million is going to be blown through the roof. So the money in electoral politics problem is not going away. How about the electoral system? Congressional districts, of course, are based on census data, which is done every 10 years, where House districts must be reapportioned among the states and lines must be redrawn to reflect population changes, right? Americans move a lot in the United States. We move often, more so than people in France or Germany. And so the representation in the House must be tweaked about every 10 years, and that's done through the census, which was done in 2020. And so California actually, for the first time in its history, lost a seat based on the 2020 census data. Texas gained 2. There is a lot at stake in how these lines are drawn. I'm going to come back to this notion of gerrymandering later in these slides here, but the notion of gerrymandering is when voters can be arranged so as to give an advantage to one political party over another, right? So how district lines are drawn within a state tends to be important. In California, this is done through a nonpartisan commission. In Texas, it's done by the legislature, which is controlled by Republicans. So that's where the gerrymandering comes into play, where, say, with these two new seats coming into Texas after 2020, you bet your bottom dollar that the Republican-controlled legislature is going to do its best to make sure that Republicans gain those 2 seats. But here, this is just to give you some brief info here about how people move over time from 1960 to 2010. The population in New England and the Mid-Atlantic states declined. That's traditionally where most of us have been concentrated in the United States. People have left the Midwest as well, and we see growing populations in the West, Southwest, and Southeast, right? That's natural. There's nothing wrong with that, nothing partisan about that at all. People move. We move for better jobs. We move for lots of different reasons. But that needs to be, these changes, however delayed, need to be reflected in how representation takes root in Congress. Problems of legislative organization. Cooperation among many members is difficult for lots of reasons. It's hard to match influence and interest. Each member has particular priorities, but one vote on every issue. No one legislature can be an expert on every policy area. So you see, especially people who've been in Congress for a long time often gain or claim expertise in certain areas. President Biden was in the Senate for forever and had been very active in foreign affairs. So, that's kind of what he was known for as a senator. And that's not unique to him. Lots of different senators have different areas of expertise. Compliance, monitoring legislative deals and legislative outcomes requires collective effort, and party loyalty shifts over topic and time. That's true too. Not all Republicans think the same way about every issue. Not every Democrat thinks the same way about every issue. So although we've seen greater polarization, and I'm definitely going to come back to this throughout the semester. It's not to say that all Republicans think exactly the same, nor do all Democrats think exactly the same, even in Congress. When it comes to parties and legislative organization, members of Congress organize themselves into party coalitions in the House and Senate called a caucus for the Democrats or a conference for the Republicans. It's more of a trivia piece of information, and I'm not going to ask you about that on the test, I don't think. Members choose their leaders, whether that's the Speaker of the House or the Majority Leader, Minority Leader of the Senate. The party that controls, that has the most members in the House, chooses the Speaker of the House. And then each party, whether it's in the majority or the minority, will choose a leader in the Senate. Members empower party leaders to influence the agenda and manage legislation. Oftentimes, you're not going to find laws proposed by leaders in either chamber by any party that those leaders themselves do not agree with. They have their own gatekeeping authority, much like committees do too. So within each chamber, we find lots of committees. Members organize themselves into standing committees divided by policy jurisdiction. There are often similar committees in the House and the Senate, whether that is, say, on foreign relations or health, transportation, you name it. There's a jurisdictional committee in the House and Senate for these big policy issues. This means that committees have what's called gatekeeping authority, the right to decide if a change in policy will be considered. Katznelson calls the committees little legislatures because most bills die in committee. Both texts make this point plainly clear. The vast majority of proposed laws that begin debate in committee don't make it out of committee. So here's a list of the committees. This is from the Lowy text, but you can see a lot of overlap between the House and the Senate. This has a lot to do with the fact that when a bill becomes a law, the same bill, the same version needs to be passed in both states, or starting both chambers. So that's why there's really parallel committee structure in both chambers, logically. Staffers and agencies, each member of Congress has a staff, and they provide assistance on writing legislation to corresponding with constituents. Committees themselves often have staffers who are meant to be nonpartisan. Members of Congress have very partisan staff members, right? You're not going to be a staff member for a staunch Republican if you're a Bernie bro, for example. That's just not how it works. Committees have staffers who, again, are meant to be nonpartisan. Congress has staff agencies such as the Government Accountability Office, the Congressional Budget Office, which are meant to provide nonpartisan policy advice to members. And often with those, the Congressional Research Service is the CRS. This is meant to be, again, nonpartisan data that says to members of Congress, hey, this is how much this bill might cost in a decade if this law were to pass, so on and so forth. Caucuses are groups of senators and representatives who share certain opinions, interests, or social characteristics. These can overlap, so you can have members of the House and the Senate get together and have caucus meetings now and again. Caucuses seek to advance the interest of groups they represent by promoting legislation and congressional hearings and working with administrative agencies to further their goals. There are a ton of them. This is a link to Wikipedia page. I'm not going to take the time to click on it now, but I mean, there's different agricultural caucuses. The Black Caucus is pretty important. There's like the Latvian caucus. I mean, there's all sorts of crazy caucuses for lots of different interests. Feel free to look at that if you like. How a bill becomes a law. This is discussed in both Katznelson and Lowy. Bills must be first introduced by a member of Congress and referred to committees. This is why the gatekeeping of the committees is so important, because most bills die in committee. Some are referred to a subcommittee. Some are amended. Some are reported out to the full chamber. Once they reach the full chamber, there can be debate and then votes. Debate in the House. Bills reported out of committee first go to the Rules Committee, which determines the rules under which the bill will be debated on the floor. And the majority party sets these rules. There can be closed rule where there are no introduction of amendments to the bill, and that's basically forcing members of Congress to vote on the bill as it is. If there's an open rule, there can be the addition of amendments, and that's where members of Congress can tag on amendments that might have nothing to do with the bill, but that seek to bring money back to their constituents, to their districts, right? In the Senate, it's a bit different. The Senate is meant to have a tradition of unlimited debate. Takes 3/5 of the Senate or 60 votes to invoke cloture or the end of debate. So if you don't have 60 senators saying, "Hey, let's vote on this," then the bill will never come up for a full vote on the floor. And this has meant that recently, thanks to greater partisanship and polarization, the minority, as long as the minority has 41 votes, can threaten to use the filibuster, which is a delaying tactic in which senators do not allow debate to end, which in effect kills the legislation. So if you can't get 60 senators to at least vote to hold a vote, then your project, your bill is going to die. We've seen much greater use of the filibuster from 1923 to 2014. It's a bipartisan thing, but you can definitely see here that our Republican friends have utilized it much more in recent years. I mean, this was the rule of the day during the Obama administration, when Republicans in the Senate they invoked the filibuster. You've got a hyperlink here that takes you to another John Oliver clip, Last Week Tonight clip on the filibuster. Been in the news a lot, will be in the news a lot for the next coming years, I'm sure. How about reconciling bills? For a bill to become a law, a bill must be passed in exactly the same form in both chambers. Frequently, two chambers send the bill back and forth until one chamber passes a version passed by the other. Sometimes the two chambers will form a conference committee, which is appointed with members from each chamber and each party to work out differences and come up with a clean bill that then goes back for a vote. Usually when that happens, if there's a conference committee and a new bill is proposed, it's passed pretty quickly. After that, the president steps in, right? This is where our checks and balances, our branches of government come into play. President can veto legislation. Congress can override the veto with 2/3 vote in either chamber. Presidents generally just use the threat of a veto to shape legislation and try to avoid the embarrassment of having a veto overridden. It's pretty rare. I think Trump had one veto overridden, having something to do with the civil war in Yemen and U.S. support for Saudi Arabia. But it's pretty rare, especially this day and age as we become more polarized and parties act more in unison. We see less of this, but the president needs to sign a bill for it to become a law. And lo and behold, I know you've been waiting for it. Here is the hyperlink to the Schoolhouse Rock old school how a bill becomes a law. The classic "I'm just a bill up on Capitol Hill," and we would watch this in class, and everybody would laugh until we cried. But it's a good one. You probably saw it when you were a kid. I saw it when I was a kid. Way back when we had to rub sticks together to create fire. PBS was still on then, and it was good. It was good. So watch that. How members decide on how to vote, right? They can think back to the chart that I had up at the outset of the slides. Do members care about what their constituents think? Members will care about what the constituents think on election day, so members have to think about what the constituency wants. Because interest groups generate more money than most individual constituents, members have to think about what interest groups want, right? And how interest groups educate the public, mobilize constituents for or against the representative, and how they donate, right? This is where lobbyists come into play. Here's another link to yet another Last Week Tonight story, or this one might be Hassan Minhaj on lobbyists. I don't remember, but it's a good one. And then party voting, right? Members listen to party leaders more so today than they did 50 years ago. I think the age of Trump and beyond has shown that for the time being, party loyalty is demanded by leaders, and it could be to the detriment of your role in the party if you don't follow the party line, especially with our Republican friends. You might see this photo here from the Lowy textbook and think, oh, this must be an interest group made up of elderly African American women. These are elderly African American women, but they're members of the AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons, which is perhaps the strongest, most influential interest group made up of people who don't necessarily have much money. You don't have to be wealthy to be an AARP member. Pretty much once you hit a certain age, you start getting bombarded with mail from AARP. You can pay dues and be an official member. You don't have to be necessarily, but the AARP works in the interests of elderly people. And again, it's a very important interest group that isn't an oil company. This is data from Lowy, indicative of party unity over time. So you can see that both in the House and the Senate, party unity has tended to go up over time. It's not 100%, and it does vary. But what we mean by this is when members in the House and the Senate vote together, right, in unison, and it's indicative of the polarization that we see more broadly in the United States. Here we see more evidence of the same. This is also from the Lowy text from the 16th edition, but the same data is in the 15th. I know if you have the 16th edition, I'm looking at pages 154 and 155 here, but you can see that this has decreased. We've seen Republicans become more conservative over time. Democrats become more liberal in both the House and the Senate. And again, this is only going to lead to a vicious cycle, if you will, of increasing polarization, right? Add to this other factors of partisanship in Congress. Party leaders are increasingly important because it's the party leaders who decide who gets committee assignments, right? And a lot of, especially new members of particularly the House, they have a wish list of which committees they want to be on, but they don't just get to pick, right? So party leaders are going to give the better assignments to those who are going to do what party leaders want. Party leaders also are gatekeepers, if you will, of access to the floor for members of Congress to speak. We could talk about how party leaders whip their members, which is a way of saying to try to get everyone to vote together. There can be log rolling, which is like mutual back scratching and trade-offs, deals made to get votes. And then increasing power and visibility for the president. We've seen this with President Trump, former President Trump, and criticism of him after he's left office. We've seen some major Republicans really lose their influence in the House because of their criticism of former President Trump, Republicans. And then gerrymandering, of course. And here's a link that does include a lot of potty humor from, yet again, John Oliver. I'm sorry to bombard you with the guy from Liverpool talking about U.S. politics, but he does a very good job of explaining things, and he's pretty funny. But here is the John Oliver breakdown of gerrymandering, which is yet another driver of partisanship in Congress. I promise you I'm about done. Let's wrap up quickly here. The California legislature, boundary lines used to be drawn by legislatures themselves, and then under a proposition in 2008, and this had the backing, I do believe, of then Governor Schwarzenegger, there was created a Citizens Redistricting Commission to draw all House districts. And I think that's a pretty good thing. Iowa does something similar. California does. In a lot of other states, the districts for the U.S. House are drawn by the state legislature, which is often done very much partisanly, if you will. Size matters. State Senate districts contain more people than U.S. House districts, right? Only 40 members of the California Senate, population of about 40 million. So it's interesting that California senators, state senators, represent more people than members of the U.S. House, right? That's just an indicator of the sheer size of California. Other congressional powers here, oversight. And we're zooming out again back to D.C., but this also happens in Sacramento. Congress can hold hearings to oversee what other branches of government have done. This is often very partisan. The U.S. Senate has the power to advise and consent to presidential actions like, say, naming the cabinet, appointing judges or justices to the Supreme Court, approving international treaties, ratification of treaties. That's the Senate only. These are often done in very partisan fashion, whereas when the Senate is controlled by the same party as the president, everything goes through, and when the Senate is of a different party than the president, we see heads butt. Impeachment is another congressional power. This has kind of been in the news in recent years. The U.S. House votes to impeach a sitting president, which is like an indictment. That then leads to a trial conducted in the Senate that requires 2/3 of the senators to convict. We've seen 4 impeachments in U.S. history, 0 convictions, right? Because again, in practice, it's not a legal procedure, it's a political procedure, and it's inherently partisan. And this is a hyperlink to a Samantha Bee clip talking with Ilhan Omar, who's a representative from Minnesota, Somali-born female Muslim in Congress, again from Minnesota. She's very critical of President Trump. And then as a consequence, its utility has been called into question. This is a link that will take you to a Fox News clip interview with Jim Jordan, a member of the House from Ohio, very conservative, basically calling into question the utility of impeachment if we know that it's a foregone conclusion, right? So, up to you to decide. Is it worth it? The last 3 impeachments of Clinton and then twice of Trump didn't really go anywhere. Neither did investigations of this Clinton, Hillary Clinton, who in the run-up to the 2016 election, as the House was controlled by Republicans, was called in for hearing after hearing after hearing for hours upon days at a time about the September 11, 2012 attacks on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi, Libya. Many people called that a bit farcical. Not it was a real political stunt just to try to weaken Clinton before the 2016 elections. Did it work? It's hard to say, but she didn't win the election, so who knows? Here is my last slide. I promise this is a loaded question. I am aware. Does Congress work? I'll refer you back to the approval ratings we looked at the outset. Appears to be a big no, right? Congress doesn't really work like we would think it would. It's often difficult to balance efficiency within Congress and constituent representation. Building the supermajority coalitions necessary to pass legislation, particularly in the Senate, leads to a distributive tendency in legislation, meaning that bills are frequently designed to distribute policy benefits as widely as possible to try to get as many senators and members of the House to vote for a bill in question. But it doesn't always work out that way. So it'll be interesting to see in the coming, the 4 years of the Biden administration, how the president and Congress get along, especially after the 2022 midterms. We'll see. But anyway, there's Congress. We're done. Take care, be well, and be in touch as you need. Bye-bye.